The winter air bit sharply through Malachius Walker's threadbare coat, while his fingers danced across his violin strings. Each note ascended like smoke into Louisiana's gray sky. The date was January 12, 1869, a Sunday afternoon in Lafayette, and the square buzzed with the uneasy energy of a world completely inverted. Nearly 4 years had passed since the war ended. Yet in hearts such as Colonel Silas Thorne's, the battle persisted endlessly. Malachius didn't initially notice the colonel approaching. His eyes remained closed, adrift in the melody emerging from the battered instrument cradled in his hands. The violin was old, practically ancient, its varnish worn by decades of use to a dull patina, its wood scarred and weathered by time. Yet when Malachius played, it sang with a voice transcending its humble exterior. The sound emerged pure, crystalline, achingly beautiful. It was the sound of something that shouldn't exist in a world as harsh and unforgiving as this one. Before we proceed with this remarkable story, please subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're listening from. Thank you. And now let's return to the story. The gathered crowd stood in a semicircle, their faces reflecting both wonder and discomfort. Freed men like Malachius stood there, their Sunday clothes pressed and proper, their features still learning dignity's expression without fear. Poor whites were present too, their resentment visible in clenched jaws and narrowed eyes. And the former aristocrats stood among them. Planters and merchants whose world had collapsed like a house of cards when the Confederacy fell. They now clung to their pride's wreckage like shipwrecked sailors grasping driftwood. Colonel Silas Thorne belonged to that final category, though he would rather die than admit sharing anything with anyone. At 53, he stood hollowed out by bitterness, his once handsome face now mapped perpetual anger's lines. His plantation Thornwood still stood on Lafayette's outskirts, but only as a shadow of its former glory. The fields lay fallow. The great house deteriorated steadily, and the colonel's fortune had evaporated like morning dew beneath a merciless sun. Yet what gnawed at Silas Thorne more than poverty, more than defeat, more than the humiliation of watching former slaves walk freely through his streets, was that violin sound, that damned violin in that boy's hands. The music stopped abruptly. Malachius opened his eyes to find the colonel standing directly before him, so close he could smell whiskey on the man's breath and see broken blood vessels mapping his nose. The crowd fell silent, sensing electricity in the air, that promise of violence trailing Silas Thorne like his own shadow. "That's a mighty fine instrument you've got there, boy," Thorne said, his voice deceptively soft. Something in his tone made several people instinctively step backward. "Where'd a harm he like you get something like that?" Malachius's jaw tightened, yet his voice remained steady when he spoke. "It was given to me, sir, by someone who wanted me to have it. Given to you." Thorne repeated, as if tasting the words and finding them bitter. "And who, pray tell, would give a valuable instrument like that to the likes of you?" Something strange was happening in the colonel's face. Something beyond simple racist contempt. His eyes fixed on the violin with an intensity bordering on recognition, and his hands had begun trembling slightly. Was it rage? Or something else? Something more complicated? A gentleman who believed music belonged to those who could play it. Malachius said carefully. He drew the violin closer to his chest, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed. "A gentleman." Thorne spat the word like a curse. "Let me see it." "With respect, sir, I'd rather not." The colonel's hand shot out faster than seemed possible for a man his age, his fingers closing around the violin's neck. Malachius instinctively pulled back, and for a moment both men stood frozen in a grotesque tug of war, the instrument suspended between them. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the spectacle despite themselves. "Let go, boy," Thorn hissed, something desperate in his voice now, something beyond simple cruelty. "Let go before I, please," Malachias said, the word emerging as barely more than a whisper. "Please, sir, it's all I have." And that was when Silas Thorn made his decision. With a violent wrench, he tore the violin from Malachias's grasp, held it momentarily aloft as if displaying a trophy, then brought it down with all his strength against the square's stone pavement. The sound of splintering wood cracked through the air like a gunshot. The violin's body split open, strings snapping with musical screams, the bridge flying free like a wounded bird. Thorn raised it again and smashed it down once more, then again, until what had been beautiful was reduced to scattered, broken pieces across the cold stone. The following silence was absolute. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Malachias stood frozen, his empty hands still raised in the position they'd held when the instrument was torn away, his eyes fixed on the wreckage at his feet. Colonel Thorn stood over the destroyed violin, his chest heaving with exertion, his face flushed with something that might have been triumph, or perhaps something darker, more desperate. He turned to face the crowd, his eyes sweeping across their shocked faces. "Let that be a lesson," he said, his voice carrying across the silent square. "To all of you. There are some things that don't belong in the hands of your kind. Some things that will never be yours, no matter what pieces of paper the government in Washington sends down here." But as he spoke, something unexpected happened. His eyes fell on the wreckage again, and his expression shifted. The flush drained from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. He took one step back, then another, as if the broken wood pieces on the ground had suddenly become dangerous. What had he seen? What detail in the destruction had captured his attention? Malachias didn't notice the colonel's reaction. He was already kneeling, his hands moving carefully through the debris, gathering pieces as tenderly as if they were a beloved friend's bones. His face remained utterly still, revealing nothing of his feelings, but his hands trembled as they worked, sorting through splinters and fragments. "Malachias," a voice said softly. It was Reverend Johnson, the African Methodist Episcopal Church pastor, a tall man with graying hair and eyes that had witnessed too much suffering to be surprised by any new cruelty. "Son, leave it. It's gone. Come away now." But Malachias didn't respond. He continued gathering pieces, his movements methodical, almost ritualistic. And as he worked, as his fingers traced the broken edges of what had been his most precious possession, he felt something strange, something that shouldn't have been there. One of the larger pieces, part of the violin's back, felt wrong in his hands. Too light, too hollow, and there was an edge, a seam where solid wood should have been. His fingers found a crack that went deeper than the damage from Thorn's violence. This crack was old, deliberate, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. And now, with the instrument destroyed, the crack had widened just enough to reveal something hidden for years. Malachias's breath caught in his throat, his hands stilled. Around him, people were beginning to move again, to whisper, to shake their heads and disperse. The show was over. Colonel Thorn had already turned and was walking away, his shoulders rigid, his gait unsteady. But Malachias saw and heard none of this, because his fingers had just discovered that his violin had been keeping a secret, and if what he suspected was true, then the last 5 minutes had changed everything in ways no one could yet imagine. What was hidden in that violin? Why had Colonel Thorn's expression changed so dramatically when he looked at the wreckage? And who had given Malachias this instrument in the first place? Reverend Johnson crouched beside him, placing a comforting hand on the young man's shoulder. "Come on, son," Mrs. Patterson will give you supper. You can stay with us tonight, Reverend, Malachias said quietly, his voice strange and distant. I need to go home right now. Malachias, there's nothing. Please. The young man looked up, and something in his eyes made the Reverend pause. Not grief, not anger, but an electric intensity suggesting sudden understanding. I need to go home. There's something I have to see. He stood, cradling the violin's larger pieces in his arms like precious cargo, leaving the smaller splinters behind. Without another word, without looking at anyone, he began walking quickly away from the square, heading toward the modest cabin collection on the town's eastern edge where freedmen lived. The crowd watched him go, confused by his sudden departure. Several people shook their heads, assuming the boy was simply overcome with emotion, retreating to grieve privately. They would soon learn how wrong they were. Colonel Thorne, now half a block away, stopped walking. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the street, his back to the square, his head slightly tilted as if listening for something. Then, without warning, he turned and looked back. His eyes found Malachias's retreating figure, and his face went pale. No, he whispered to himself. No, he couldn't have. He wouldn't have. But who was he talking about? And what couldn't or wouldn't they have done? Thorne's hand went to his coat pocket, fumbling for something. He pulled out a silver pocket watch, flipped it open, and stared at the time. Then he looked back toward the square, toward his own house in the distance, and made a decision. He began walking quickly in the opposite direction from his home, toward Bertram Coates's law offices on Main Street. Meanwhile, Malachias was nearly running now, his arms full of broken wood, his mind racing. The cabin he shared with his mother and younger sister came into view. A small structure with a patched roof, and smoke rising from the chimney. His mother would be inside preparing Sunday dinner. She would ask questions. He would have to explain what happened. But first, he had to examine what he'd found. He had to be sure. The violin had been given to him 3 years ago, in the summer of 1866, by an old white man named Tobias Thorne. The colonel's father, Thornwood Plantation's patriarch, a man who had ruled his little kingdom with absolute authority for 40 years. And on his deathbed, burning with fever, Tobias Thorne had called for one person and one person only. He had called for Malachias. Why had the old master wanted to see a young freedman in his final hours? Why had he given him the violin with such urgency, such strange intensity? And why had he made Malachias promise with his dying breath never to let anyone take it from him? Keep it safe, Tobias had whispered, his papery hand gripping Malachias's wrist with surprising strength. Keep it close. No matter what happens, promise me. Malachias had promised, not understanding, not questioning. The old man had been kind to him in his way, had taught him to play when he was just a child working in Thornwood's gardens, had called him to the big house weekly for lessons, ignoring his son Silas's disapproving looks, the whispered scandals among other planters' wives. Why would a man like Tobias Thorne care about teaching a slave child to play the violin? What had driven him to defy convention, to risk his community standing, to anger his own son? And now, 3 years after Tobias's death, his son had destroyed the instrument with a fury that seemed almost personal, almost desperate, as if he'd been searching for an excuse to do exactly that for years. Malachias burst through his cabin door, startling his mother, who was stirring a pot over the fire. Sarah Walker was a woman in her early 40s who looked 10 years older. Her hands were work, roughened, her face lined with hardship's accumulated weight. But her eyes remained sharp, intelligent, and they saw immediately that something was wrong. Malachias, what happened? Where's your violin? He didn't answer. He went directly to the small table in the corner, serving as his workspace, swept aside the few items there, and carefully laid out the broken instrument's pieces. His hands were shaking now, and he had to force himself to move slowly, deliberately. "Baby, what happened?" His mother was beside him now, her hand on his back. Then she saw the destruction, the splintered wood, and her breath hitched.
"Oh Lord, Malachias!"
"Who did this?" Kunal Thorne. His voice was flat, controlled, but his mother knew him well enough to hear the rage beneath it. Sarah's face hardened. "That devil. That evil, bitter devil. He's been looking for a reason ever since his daddy died. Ever since." She stopped abruptly, as if catching herself before saying something she shouldn't. Malachias looked up at her sharply. "Ever since what, Mama?" "Nothing. I just meant ever since the criminal took over the plantation." Times have been hard for him. But something in her voice, something evasive that Malachias had never heard before, caught his attention. He studied his mother's face, seeing things he'd never noticed. The way her eyes wouldn't quite meet his. The tension in her shoulders. The way her hand had unconsciously gone to her throat, touching a small scar there that she usually kept hidden. "Mama, what aren't you telling me?" "Nothing, baby. I'm just sorry about your violin. I know how much it meant to you." But Malachias was no longer listening. He had picked up the largest piece of the violin's back, the one with the strange crack, and was examining it in the light from the window. His fingers found the seam, worked at it gently. The wood was old, the glue weakened by time and the violence of its destruction. With a soft cracking sound, a section of the back panel separated, revealing a hollow space that should not have existed. Violins were solid instruments, their construction precise and uniform. There should not have been any hidden cavities. But there was. And inside it, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture and time, was something that made Malachias's heart begin pounding. It was a document, several pages actually, folded and sealed with red wax that had cracked with age. The seal bore an imprint, a family crest that Malachias recognized immediately. It was the same crest appearing on Thornwood Plantation's iron gates, the Thorne family seal. His hands froze. He looked up at his mother, who had gone completely still, her eyes fixed on the folded papers with an expression of pure shock. Or was it fear or recognition? "Mama," he said slowly, "did you know this was here?" Sarah Walker's mouth opened, then closed. No words came out. She looked from the documents to her son's face and back again. And in her eyes, Malachias saw confirmation. She had known. Maybe not exactly what was hidden, but she had known there was something. Who was my father? The question came out before Malachias even realized he was going to ask it. It was a question he had never asked before. A question his mother had always deflected with vague references to. "A good man who died before you were born." His mother's face went gray. "Malachias, don't." "Who was he?" "Baby, please. Some things are better left." "Who was he?" The shout filled the small cabin, echoing off the walls. His mother flinched as if struck. In the corner, his younger sister Naomi, 10 years old, emerged from behind the curtain separating the sleeping area, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah Walker seemed to age 10 years in an instant. Her shoulders sagged, and she sank into the room's only chair, as if her legs would no longer support her. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. His name was Tobias Thorne. The world seemed to tilt. Malachias heard the words, understood them individually, but couldn't make them connect into meaning. Tobias Thorne, the old master, the man who had taught him to play violin, the man who had given him the instrument on his deathbed. His father. "No," Malachias said. "No, that's not possible. I was 17, his mother said, and now the words came faster, as if a dam had broken. "He was 45. I worked in the big house. I didn't have a choice, baby. You have to understand that. I didn't have a choice about anything back then. The implications crashed over Malachius like a wave. If Tobias Thorne was his father, then Colonel Silas Thorne was his half-brother. The man who had just destroyed his violin was family. And suddenly the colonel's rage, his personal hatred, made a terrible kind of sense. But there was more. If these documents bore the Thorne family's seal, if Tobias had hidden them inside the violin, and then given that violin to his illegitimate son with such urgency, such insistence that it never be taken away, then what did they contain? Malachius's hands moved almost of their own accord, breaking the ancient wax seal and unfolding the pages. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used for important legal documents. The handwriting was elegant, each letter perfectly formed. But the ink had faded to a rusty brown with age. He began to read, and with each line, each paragraph, each revelation, the small cabin seemed to grow larger. The world seemed to expand and contract simultaneously. It was a will. Tobias Thorne's last will and testament written in his own hand, dated September 15th, 1860, 5 years before the war ended, 9 years before this moment. But it wasn't the will anyone had seen. It wasn't the will that had transferred Thornwood Plantation to Colonel Silas Thorne. It was something else entirely. Something Tobias had clearly intended to remain hidden until after his death. Something that would protect it from being changed or destroyed while he still lived. Malachius's eyes raced across the pages, his breath coming faster. His mother was talking, asking questions, but he couldn't hear her. The words on the page were too loud, too impossible, too world-shattering. Tobias Thorne, in this secret will, had acknowledged Malachius by name, had called him his son, and had bequeathed to him, in recognition of the sin I committed in bringing him into this world, without the protection of my name, and in hope of making some small recompense for that wrong. The entirety of Thornwood Plantation, including the house, the land, and all properties and assets associated with it. But there was more. Attached to the will was a separate document, older still, that made Malachius's blood run cold. It was a certificate of manumission dated 1858 that freed Sarah Walker and granted freedom to any children born to her. Born or yet to be born. His mother had been freed 11 years ago. He had been free his entire life, but no one had known because Tobias Thorne had hidden the document, had kept the secret, had allowed his own son to live as a slave even as the law said he was free.
Why?
Why would a man do such a thing? Malachius looked up from the pages, his mind reeling. His mother was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face, and Malachius understood in a flash of terrible insight why Tobias had hidden these documents even as he wrote them. Because in 1860 in the South, such revelations would have gotten Sarah killed, would have gotten Malachius killed, would have destroyed any chance they had of surviving. Tobias had waited, had kept the secret, had preserved the documents until after the war, until freedom came and made such truths survivable. But he had died too soon. He had died before he could reveal what he had done, before he could make the will public. And so he had hidden it in the one place where he knew it would eventually be found. In the one object that he knew would stay with his son, the violin. Malachius stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the rough wooden floor. His mind raced, trying to understand the implications, trying to see the path forward. These documents, if they were authentic, if they could be verified, changed everything. They meant Silas Thorne had been living in a house that didn't belong to him, managing a plantation that wasn't his, acting as master of an estate that had legally passed to someone else 9 years ago. But would anyone believe it? Would any court in Louisiana, in this fragile and violent time of Reconstruction, honor a will that left a white man's entire estate to his illegitimate black son? Or would these papers be dismissed as forgeries, as fantasies, as dangerous delusions? And more importantly, what would Silas Thorne do when he learned what these documents contained? Because Malachias suddenly understood with absolute certainty why the colonel had destroyed the violin with such fury. He had suspected. Maybe he hadn't known for sure, but he had suspected his father had hidden something, had left something behind that would threaten Silas's claim to Thornwood. The colonel's strange reaction when he looked at the wreckage, his sudden departure toward the law offices, it all made a terrible kind of sense. Silas knew, or at least he feared, and a man like Silas Thorne, desperate and cornered, was capable of anything. "I have to go," Malachias said abruptly. His mother grabbed his arm. "Where?" "Malachias, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to find the federal marshal. I'm going to show him these documents." "None." Sarah's grip tightened, her fingernails digging into his skin. "Baby, no. You'll get yourself killed. The colonel has friends. He has guns. He has nothing, Mama. Don't you see? According to these papers, he has nothing. Thornwood is mine. Has been mine since I was 11 years old." "Papers don't mean anything if you're dead." Sarah was shouting now, something Malachias had never heard her do. "You think white folks in this town are going to let a black boy walk into court and claim ownership of the biggest plantation in the parish? You think they're going to honor your father's wishes? They'll call you a liar. They'll call you worse, and then they'll string you up from the nearest tree." She was right. Of course, Malachias knew she was right. The rational part of his mind, the part that had learned to navigate post-war Louisiana's dangerous waters, was screaming at him to hide the documents, to leave town, to forget he had ever seen them. But another part of him, a part he had never fully acknowledged before, burned with a righteous fury that would not be contained. His father had denied him in life, had kept him enslaved even as he wrote words of freedom, had watched him grow up in the fields while living in luxury in the big house. But in death, Tobias Thorne had tried to make amends. He had given Malachias not just freedom but dignity, not just acknowledgement but restitution, and Malachias would be damned if he let fear keep him from claiming what was rightfully his. "I'm going," he said quietly, gently removing his mother's hand from his arm. "I have to. You understand that, don't you?" Sarah looked at her son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time, seeing not the boy she had raised but the man he had become. She saw Tobias in his face, in the set of his jaw, in the determined glint in his eyes, and she saw something else too, something purely Malachias, purely himself. "Then I'm coming with you," she said. "Mama, no, don't argue. If you're going to do this fool thing, you're not doing it alone. Naomi, stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but us." The little girl nodded, her eyes huge in her small face, clearly not understanding what was happening, but sensing its gravity. Malachias carefully folded the documents and placed them inside his coat next to his heart. He took one last look at the destroyed violin on the table, at the instrument that had carried this secret for so many years. Then he and his mother walked out into the cold January afternoon, heading back toward Lafayette's center. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. Malachias checked the time on the church clock as they passed. It was just after 2:05. 2 hours since the violin had been destroyed. 2 hours since his world had been shattered and remade. What would the next 2 hours bring? The federal marshal's office was on Bourbon Street, in a modest building that had once housed a Confederate recruiting station. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Marshal James Garrett was a Massachusetts man sent south as part of the Reconstruction administration, and he was one of the few white officials in Louisiana whom freedmen trusted to dispense anything resembling justice. But even Garrett had his limits. Even he had to live in this town, had to navigate the treacherous political waters between the old Confederate establishment and the new federal order. Would he be willing to enforce a claim as explosive as this one? They would find out soon enough. As they walked through the streets, Malachias noticed people staring. Word had already spread about the incident in the square. Some faces showed sympathy, others satisfaction. Still others simple curiosity. But no one tried to stop them, and for that Malachias was grateful. They turned onto Bourbon Street, and the marshal's office came into view. And that was when Malachias saw the horse tied outside, a magnificent black stallion with the Thornwood brand on its flank. Colonel Silas Thorne was already there. Malachias's steps faltered. His mother grabbed his hand, squeezing hard. For a moment, they both stood frozen, uncertain. Then the office door opened, and Marshal Garrett emerged with the colonel at his side. The two men were talking in low, urgent voices. Garrett was in his mid-30s, tall and lean, with the weathered look of a former cavalry officer. He saw Malachias and his mother approaching, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, concern, or had he been expecting them? Colonel Thorne turned to see what had caught the marshal's attention. And when his eyes fell on Malachias, his face went through a rapid series of transformations: shock, fear, rage, and finally something harder and colder settled into place. He looked at Malachias's coat, at the place where the documents were hidden, and a thin smile curved his lips. "Well," he said softly, "look who's here, Colonel." Marshal Garrett began, his voice carefully neutral. "Perhaps you should." "I'll stay, thank you, Marshal. I have a feeling this concerns me." Malachias forced himself to keep walking, to close the distance between them. He could feel the documents' weight against his chest, could feel his mother's hand trembling in his. When he spoke, he was surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. "Marshal Garrett, I need to report a crime. Colonel Thorne destroyed my property this afternoon in the town square. I hardly think a broken fiddle constitutes a federal offense." "Boy," Thorne said with a sneer. "It wasn't just a fiddle, sir. It was given to me by your father on his deathbed." Something flashed in Thorne's eyes. "My father gave away many things in his final illness. His mind was not sound." "His mind was perfectly sound," Malachias countered. "Sound enough to hide something he wanted me to have. Something you've been looking for." The colonel's jaw tightened. Marshal Garrett looked between the two men, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his holstered pistol. "What are you talking about, Malachias?" the marshal asked. Instead of answering, Malachias reached into his coat and pulled out the folded documents. He held them up, making sure both men could see the broken seal, the Thorne family crest. These were hidden inside the violin. "My father, Tobias Thorne, put them there before he gave the instrument to me. They're legal documents, sir. A will and a certificate of manumission." The silence that followed was broken only by wind sound and a distant dog's bark. Colonel Thorne had gone absolutely still, his face drained of color. Marshal Garrett's eyes widened slightly, but he maintained his professional composure. "Those are forgeries," Thorne said flatly. "Obvious forgeries. The boy made them himself." "I can verify my father's handwriting, Marshal," Malachias said, his heart pounding. "And I believe you can too. There are records in this office, documents Tobias Thorne signed, land deeds, tax records. Compare the handwriting." "Don't be absurd," Thorne snapped. "You expect us to believe my father would leave Thornwood to you? It's ridiculous. Impossible." "Is it?" Malachias met the colonel's eyes directly, seeing his own features reflected in that furious face. The same bone structure, the same arch of the eyebrows. How had he never noticed before? Was it impossible for a man to acknowledge his own blood? The words hung in the air like a blade. Sarah gasped softly, and Marshal Garrett's eyes darted from Malachias to Thorn and back again, understanding dawning. Lies, Thorn hissed. Vicious lies. Marshal, I demand you arrest this boy for what exactly? Garrett's voice was quiet but firm. For having documents that may or may not be authentic. Malachias, may I see those papers? Malachias handed them over, watching as the marshal unfolded them carefully and began to read. Garrett's face remained neutral, but his eyes moved faster as he progressed through the text. When he finished, he looked up at Malachias with an expression difficult to read. These are serious allegations, he said finally. If authentic, these documents would represent a significant property transfer. But authentication will take time. I'll need to compare handwriting samples, possibly bring in expert witnesses, consult with the federal court in Baton Rouge. How long? Malachias asked. Weeks, maybe months. During which time? Colonel Thorn interjected smoothly, having recovered some composure. This boy will be free to concoct whatever story he likes, to gather supposed witnesses, to create a web of lies designed to steal my family's property. Your family's property. Malachias's voice rose despite himself. You mean the property you inherited through a will no one ever saw, the will that appeared conveniently after your father's death with no witnesses to its signing? There were witnesses, Thorn shouted. Decker, Harrison and Judge Peyton, both your friends. Malachias shot back, both men who owed your father money. That's enough. Marshal Garrett stepped between them. Both of you back up. Colonel, Malachias raises a valid point. The will you probated was never recorded before your father's death, which is unusual for a man of his wealth and standing. He was ill. He made his final arrangements at the last moment, like many men do. Perhaps. Garrett turned to Malachias. And you, son, must understand that what you're claiming would overturn settled law, settled property rights. Even if these documents are authentic, proving their validity in court will be an uphill battle. I understand, sir. Do you? Do you understand that half the men in this town would rather see you hang than see you inherit Thornwood? Do you understand the danger you've put yourself and your family in? Malachias felt his mother's hand tighten in his own. He understood. Of course he understood. But he also understood something else. Something that had crystallized in his mind as he stood there facing his half-brother across the dusty street. Marshal, with respect, I've been in danger my whole life. Every day I've been alive, I've been in danger of being beaten, killed, sold away from my family, or worse. The only thing that's changed is now I have a chance to be in danger for something that matters, for something that's mine. Garrett studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, I'll take the documents into custody for authentication. In the meantime, both of you are to stay away from each other. Colonel, that means no retaliation. Malachias, that means no attempts to take possession of Thornwood or any of its assets. Are we clear? Perfectly, Thorn said coldly. Yes, sir, Malachias agreed. But as the marshal took the documents and turned to go back into his office, Colonel Thorn leaned close to Malachias and spoke in a voice so low only he could hear it. You've made the biggest mistake of your life, boy. My father was a fool and a race traitor, but I'm not. You'll never see a penny of Thornwood. And if you persist in this insanity, you'll find that accidents happen all the time in Louisiana, particularly to uppity Haitodopine who don't know their place. Before Malachias could respond, Thorn had turned and mounted his horse, riding away without a backward glance. Sarah pulled her son close, her whole body trembling. "He's going to kill you," she whispered.
You know that, don't you?
"He's going to kill you before he lets you take that plantation." "Maybe," Malachias said, "but maybe not. There are witnesses now. The marshal knows. If anything happens to me, it will look suspicious. You think that will stop him?" Malachias didn't answer because he didn't know. Instead, he led his mother back toward their cabin, his mind racing with everything that had happened in the past 2 hours. 2 hours ago, he had been a young freedman with nothing but a violin and a dream. Now, he was the potential heir to one of the largest plantations in Louisiana, the acknowledged son of one of the parish's most prominent families. But he was also perhaps a marked man. They reached home as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like fire. Naomi opened the door before they could knock, throwing herself into her mother's arms. The little girl had been crying, and it took several minutes to calm her down and assure her everything was all right. But was it all right? Malachias stood at the window, looking out at the gathering darkness, and wondered what the night would bring. Would Thorn send men? Would there be violence? Or would the colonel try something more subtle, more legal? Hours passed. Sarah made dinner, but none of them could eat much. They sat together in the small cabin, listening to every sound outside, jumping at every creak and groan of the old boards. But nothing happened. No one came. The night stretched on, long and anxious. Finally, near midnight, there was a knock at the door. Malachias's hand went to the knife he kept on his belt, and Sarah pushed Naomi behind her. They froze, staring at the door, as if it might sprout fangs. "Malachias Walker." A voice called from outside. "It's Marshal Garrett. I need to speak with you." Cautiously, Malachias opened the door. The marshal stood there in the moonlight, his face grave. He was alone, either a good sign or a very bad one. "Marshal, what's happened?" "I need you to come with me now." "Why? What's wrong?" Garrett glanced at Sarah and Naomi, then back at Malachias. "There's been an incident at Thornwood. Colonel Thorn is dead." The words didn't make sense at first. Malachias heard them, processed them, but couldn't quite believe them. Dead? How could he be dead? It had only been a few hours since they had stood facing each other in the street.
How?
He managed to ask. "That's what I need to determine. You need to come with me, Malachias. You may be a suspect." "A suspect?" Sarah's voice was shrill with fear. "He's been here all night. We all have. I believe you, Mrs. Walker. But there are procedures that must be followed. And there's something at the scene you need to see, Malachias. Something that changes everything." The ride to Thornwood in Marshal Garrett's wagon was surreal, like moving through a dream. The plantation looked different at night, its white columns ghostly in the moonlight, its windows dark and lifeless. Several other horses were tied outside, and lights moved inside the house. Garrett led Malachias through the front door, something he had never done before, always having entered through the back when summoned for violin lessons, and into the library. It was a grand room lined with books, dominated by a massive mahogany desk, and behind that desk, slumped in the leather chair, was Colonel Silas Thorn, or what was left of him. The colonel's head had fallen forward onto the desk, and there was blood. A lot of blood. But it wasn't the bullet wound in his temple that made Malachias's breath catch. It was what was clutched in the colonel's right hand. A pistol, and on the desk, weighted down with a crystal paperweight, was a letter. "Suicide," Marshal Garrett said quietly. "Or that's what it's meant to look like. But I need you to read this before I make any official determination." He handed Malachias the letter. It was written in a shaky hand, very different from the elegant script Malachias had seen in the documents from the violin, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakably Sela's Thorne's. The letter was a confession. In it, Thorne admitted to falsifying his father's will